Hello, everyone. This is Sergio Marrero. We're here at another episode of RBL1 Live with CEO and founder of QBio, Jeffrey Kaditz. Thanks for joining us, Jeffrey.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I've been anticipating this interview. For those that don't know, Jeffrey is a serial entrepreneur. Has just under QBio has raised over $80 million from firms such as Kozla Ventures, Andreessen Horowitz, Founders Fund, among others. He was also formerly CTO and founder of the firm, chief data scientist at DNA, and graduate at Carnegie Mellon, majoring in physics and computer science. So excited, humbled to hear a little bit about your story and your founder journey from not only founding a finance company, but now a company changing healthcare and innovation. So I'll dive in and just open it up for you. Can you share with the audience a little bit about what is QBio?
Yeah, sure. I'll try not. It's a lot to live up to. I'll try not to disappoint. So I think QBio, I actually started thinking about as an undergrad, and it really was. And I was in high energy physics, so designing high energy physics experiments, and really the question that I had was: is it possible to measure everything about a human body cheap enough, fast enough, and non-invasively enough so that you could kind of give everybody in an entire population a Star Trek physical every year? Like, can you measure everything that's changing in a human body? Can you make it fast enough and cheap enough to do that? And when would that be possible, even in theory? So I started thinking about that actually almost about 20 years ago. And then about 4 or 5 years into a firm, when a firm was kind of taking off, felt that it was and would be fine without me. I felt it was time to kind of work on something that was a little bit more of a passion project rather than just kind of, I thought was like a big opportunity.
Amazing. And if we were to take a step back, even for your first, even looking at your studies, your areas of studies, physics, computer science, and then you shifted to be a founder at a firm. How did you make that first shift into? Why did you pick a fintech company to start?
Actually, a firm was the 4th company I started, actually. I knew in high school, stumbled across a book called The New Thing, written by Michael Lewis, which is really about Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen and the rise of Netscape, among other things. And after I read that book when I was about 17, I knew that someday I was going to move to California and start companies. So I think I didn't know how I was going to do that. And so when I went to college, I think I just studied. I didn't know what I should study. So I think I studied. I originally was like, well, I'm going to study physics because it was interesting, but also I felt like just good general, very broad skill set to have regardless of what you want to do. And in the process of doing that, I ended up writing a lot of software, which led me to getting a computer science degree as well, because I was at a school where it was a very good computer science program, which ended up, I think, being very complementary, because I feel like coming out of college with not only a degree and kind of a general understanding of how the physical world works, but I think of computer science, which isn't really about programming, but more just like more about information theory, I think. And also got a kind of understanding for how the virtual world works, or how, information moves, and what are the laws that govern how information can move. And so I felt, and it turns out that those two things are really useful if you want to be an entrepreneur and build something.
And and since you've been thinking about this for 20 years on how to make the technology come alive, on doing these fast scans and learning about someone's health very quickly, what were some of the challenges that made that journey so long?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I was really waiting for was for computers to be fast enough to deal with the amount of information that would be coming off of a scanner like this. But also, our proprietary technology is something that can scan the anatomy, somebody's anatomy. But the other part of it was seeing what I think of as, which started in the early 2000s, which is, I think, is the trend, was the kind of digitization of biology, right? Like, rather than biology being a lot more like psychology in the sense that it was an observational science. Now with things like genetics, epigenetics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, it's really becoming much more of a quantitative science where you can measure the state of biological systems. And if you look back historically in just in human civilization, things go from being an art to a science, or like a meta science to a science, when we develop the tools to measure changes in the system in a commodity way, right? Like the invention of the telescope led to our understanding of planetary motion. Like thermometers help us understand the weather. Like weather, even though something as simple as a weather vane allows you to measure the direction of the wind. But until we can measure in a quantitative way, that's kind of the backbone of the scientific method, is I can measure something about a system, which means I can then measure how it's changing, and then I can try and predict the future state of a system. And if my model agrees with the actual next measurement I take, I say, okay, I understand the laws of this system. Now the next step, usually in determining whether or not your theory is correct, is to say, can I actually perturb a system and see if I can correctly influence the next measurement? That's fundamentally the scientific method, right? Is we try and understand how systems changing and predict the next change. That's what meteorology is about. That's what astrophysics, but that's what it all boils down to. So, the idea, this question was, well, if we want to make medicine really a science, what we really need is the ability to measure changes in our bodies as systems. Because until we can do that, we don't really have the information we need to make forecasts or build models that predict future changes in it, which ultimately can, let's say, is this person going to get sick, or is this person sick? Right? At the end of the day, a diagnostic is a predictive model.
And one of the aspects that, in reading up about QBio, the whole conversation of, they call it a digital twin, scanning someone's information and having in there. Can you share a little bit with the audience that may not be familiar what the concept of a digital twin is? Like, what's
manufacturing, most there's a lot of really great examples, especially like in airplanes, or especially like Formula 1 race cars, where digital twins of physical objects are used so that you can, let's say, simulate the aerodynamics of a system and improve it, or simulate the efficiency of an engine, a jet engine, or a car engine. And so you can actually iterate computationally before you go to production, right? And so this concept in manufacturing has been around for a while, but the question was, could you kind of apply the same idea, but in a little bit of a different way, to the human body, and say, well, if I can now sequence somebody's genome cheaply, I can measure information from their blood, urine, saliva very cheaply, and that's getting cheaper. The missing piece from our perspective was there's no real cheap way to measure changes in our anatomy. And our feeling was that if you can make that a commodity, along with commoditized genetics, and blood work, urine work, saliva work, then you can actually start to think about building a digital twin for a person. And that would kind of change the paradigm of what a physical is, to being, once in a while you go to a doctor and they ask you some questions, to something that's much more quantitative and much more about measuring what's changed in your body since your last medical, exam, and then fitting that to a model that could potentially forecast what your next visit might look like and what changes you could make to improve that.
Awesome. Like I start to think about, so let me take a step back. So do you envision this technology being more at the doctor replacing a physical, or also at home in people's homes? What I start thinking about is people almost notifying people before they are
I think
if they call it
eventually,
pre-diabetic or like almost stopping people from becoming sick, put that power in their hands if you're able to. Is that kind of
I think
where you guys are going?
no, I think it's a little bit different. I actually think that the best analogy I can give is, so if you step back and look at the economic problem, the fundamental economic problem in healthcare, especially if we want to move to any kind of proactive or preventative model, is simply that there's a scarcity of doctors' time. Like there simply isn't enough doctors on the planet to see every person every year. And it's not even necessarily the best use of the doctor's time for them to spend their time measuring information about you. And so our feeling is trying to automate decision making, like any kind of AI or whatever you want to call it, diagnostics is really putting I think the cart before the horse. Like the first order problem to solve is, can you automate the collection of data to a degree that you can actually determine who needs to see a doctor? Because if a doctor can only see 1,000 people a year, who's to say that they couldn't care for 10,000 people if you could automatically determine from that the 1,000 that they actually need to see in a given year? So our goal is actually, initially not is like most people think, is to be a diagnostic. It's actually more of to be a triage platform. Actually, I would say very similar to the way COVID was triaged in the population, right? Like think about how that worked. You had these drive-through sites where in 30 minutes you get like a nasal swab, you go home, and if you get a text message from your doctor, you had a televisit. And if you didn't hear anything, you just go back if you need to get another test. I think the future of primary care, at least the entry point, looks similar, where you have almost like these very high throughput sites where in 30 minutes you can go get everything non-invasively measured about your body. And if you don't hear from your doctor, you just go back next year. If the doctor wants to talk to you, you get a text message and they schedule a televisit. And that really, really scales well. And what the real goal of that platform is not to necessarily diagnose, but it's to stratify risk in a population and determine who needs to use a doctor's time in any given year. Because if you look, at least in the United States, 70% of all doctor's visits, including visits to the ER, are unnecessary. So that's a huge problem, because that means that 70% of the time that a doctor spends is basically wasted time. And that's the limiting resource in healthcare. So our question is can we make it so that 70% of a doctor's time is spent on people who actually need attention versus 30% of their time?
Awesome. And what, that makes a lot of sense in terms of making, especially with the cost of healthcare in the US, if you can make things more efficient, there's also impact there to be safe. Asking a more personal question, what inspired this for you? Like, well, where did the idea first come from?
It was a combination of things, but I think, I've lost people in my family, to things that I think could have been caught earlier, but I don't think I'm unique at all in that. I mean, I think that's kind of a universal truth in our healthcare system. A lot of people have terrible stories. I have had, personal health incidents where I was frustrated with the answers I got from doctors, and then really surprised, coming from like a background in science, how little information, or at least objective information, was being used by doctors to determine what could be wrong. And it was honestly, it was just very unscientific, and it gave me, I had a lot of time to think about it, but it gave me a lot of time to think about, well, what are the tools you would need to make, so we stopped calling it the art of medicine and called it the science of medicine. And I think the fundamental capability that we lack, that is true of any scientific discipline, is first we need the tools to be able to measure what's changing in our bodies. Like that's just the fundamental first step. And until we have that, honestly, I feel like everything we do is just going to be incrementally better in a broken system, but we're fundamentally missing a capability, which is, a commodity way to understand what's changing in our bodies.
And interesting. On the journey of building this, you've raised over $80 million. I think the last round was 60 million Series B, which is amazing. Can you share a little bit about for the aspiring founders that are seeing your track record of serial entrepreneurship? How did you go about that? And why, I guess, why 60 million in terms of an industrial product such as this?
Well, I mean, so it's either a lot or a little, depending on how you look at it. I mean, to build the technology involved with building, scanners that have, a lot of really complex parts is, just putting atoms together is just fundamentally harder and more expensive than putting
hardware is hard.
Just moving atoms is more expensive than moving bits. So I think certainly trying to solve like a problem this difficult it helps a lot to have, to be frank, have made a lot of people a lot of money in the past. Because net it's like they can make this bet and they're still up on bets on me. So that helps certainly. But I think the other aspect of it is kind of figuring out, and it's a bit of a negotiation with investors, especially if you're going to come, and say, make what sound like crazy claims. I certainly didn't go to school for biology. I have no background in biology or medical devices. To come say, I think I can put together a team that can do this better is a stretch. And so I think, and it's certainly difficult to find investors who I think can do the due diligence required, or even understand the math required to justify this. And like, I think I would break most companies down into either execution risk or technical risk. And I think historically in Silicon Valley, investors took technical risk. I think now investors mostly take execution risk or business model risk. There's very few investors these days, and I think it's kind of on the rebound, who actually take technical risk and who kind of say, okay, here's a problem that if it can be solved, we'll worry about the business model later because it's potentially such a valuable problem to solve. Most companies that start today, it's much more about, well, is there a market for this? But the product itself isn't that hard to build. It's an app or a website, or can they get traction, kind of thing. Like, what is the cost of customer acquisition? And those are, if you're solving like very hard technical problems, those are second order problems to, is material science up to the challenge? Is there a breakthrough in material science needed, or can this be done now? Are computers fast enough to solve this reasonably, or can this be done now? And that's technical risk. And so I think it's kind of about convincing investors, depending on, what kind of company you want to start, why your approach kind of mitigates those risks, whether it's a business model risk or execution risk or technical risk.
I like the way you frame that. How can we, and in terms of getting investors to make more bets focused on maybe the technical risk of problems that need to be solved, there seems to be a movement in the climate space, partly because there's a lot of externalities happening around the globe. What are, in your opinion, what are some things that we can do to move more investors to back, really tough problems like this one that would benefit folks and need to be solved?
That's a tough question, because at the end of the day,
that's why I asked you. I was like, Jeff's a smart guy. He's got to have a good answer.
As somebody who's been on both sides, of both making investments and being a partner in a lot of venture, a limited partner in a lot of venture capital firms, the way I look at companies that I want to start versus companies I want to invest in is pretty different. And there are times that I will invest in companies where I think this is a problem that has to be solved, but at the end of the day, if you're an investor, like, and if you're a professional fund manager and you have $1 billion to allocate, it's not hard necessarily to allocate $1 billion, but the problem is that if I have 100 companies, what I really want to do is maximize the return. And there are very hard problems that would be very good for humanity to solve, where the return might, like the expected value of the return simply isn't as good because it's much riskier or because the market size is smaller. Whereas, there are tons of very simple technical problems that can be solved. I mean, you look at something like Uber or Lyft, right? Like, barrier to entry is very, very low. Like, but it's the kind of thing that everybody on the planet can use very quickly. And if you have billions of people using something and you can make a few dollars a year from them, you have a very big business. And within a couple of years, versus very hard technical problems might require 10 years of investment and with unclear, margins, depending on like business model. Or so I think, I think that's a really hard problem. Like, it's always funny. You see companies like, I don't want to, the companies that I don't think are solving a problem that's really important for humanity, raising $1 billion, and it probably costs $1 billion to go to the moon. And when you kind of step back and you say, well, what is better for humanity in terms of like moving civilization forward? Is it funding the modern debit card company, or is it going to the moon? And that's not really the right question. Investors thinking, well, what is the likelihood of me returning money to my LPs? So I think it's a tough problem, and I don't know that, I don't know. And honestly, this is why government funding and research is so important. And I think we're kind of living in an age, unfortunately, where that process is breaking down a little bit, and we're seeing where private individuals, but the reality is what we're seeing though is evidence that this is broken in both private markets and public markets, is that it takes people that have insane wealth, like three of the richest people in the world are now doing things that governments can't do and private investors wouldn't fund. Like, everybody wants to invest in SpaceX now, but like Elon risked a lot of his own money first. Everybody was like, you're throwing away money, like, on cars and rockets. So it's not like there was a lot of individual risk that's involved that those guys are taking before the investors started flocking. And I think that's still a problem, and I don't know that I have a good solution for it, honestly.
Awesome. And any suggestions on the government side? You mentioned, some of it might be breaking down, but even in terms of suggestions of improvement for supporting that early stage innovation.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I think one of the government's obviously really important. The government is what the infrastructure we have, the roads that we have, the interstates, all of those things are funded by taxpayer money and maintained by taxpayer money. I think there was the question that you have to ask yourself as a citizen is, is the dollars that I spend that go to the government, what am I getting in return for it? And I think right now, there's a lot of people there's an argument that the government isn't allocating those dollars as wisely as potentially some private individuals can. So does that mean you lower taxes, or does that mean you need smarter government allocation of funds? So but both really have, in theory, have the same ultimate goal, which is how do you allocate capital in a way that benefits society best, right? And I think the debate between lower and higher taxes really is who's in a better place to do it. I think the tricky part is that the government can often make bets that might not have short-term ROI the way a private investor might want to, and so they can do things that seem less rational to a private investor. So I think it's a complicated thing. I will say that people in general are pretty predictable, and they will do what you incentivize them to do in general. And so I do think that's making policies that incentivize the behaviors we want would go a long way, because a lot of times the policies that get created don't necessarily incentivize the behaviors that you really want to see in the marketplace.
Oh, that's a great insight. I'm going to pause there for the people watching on the live stream. So thanks again, everyone watching. This is Jeffrey Kaditz, CEO and founder of QBio, revolutionizing the healthcare diagnostics and beyond. So excited for your next steps. And again, tune in next week for more amazing founders like Jeff. So thanks again, Jeff, for joining us.